The racial gap in America is one that has existed for centuries and continues to widen. So, listen to this. According to a recent study by the RAND Review, the median Black household in America has around $24,000 in savings, investments, home equity, and other elements of wealth, while the median white household has around $189,000. The research further stipulates that without potentially trillions of dollars in investments in Black households, the wealth gap is unlikely to close, and it could take that much more to even stop it from not closing again. Today, we are talking with Mr. Ron Busby. He is the president of the U.S. Black Chambers. And a good friend of AUR, and we've had him on so many times. But to tackle this issue, he's the only one I kind of wanted to bring on to talk about what's in some of these numbers that we're seeing. How do we close the wealth gap? Can we even close the wealth gap? And what can we do to help that happen? Ron, thank you for joining me again.
Thank you for having me again. And we're honored and looking forward to this conversation. It is happening. And if you had asked us this time last year, we would have had some of the similar answers. But as we've seen, even the programs that had historically had success in Black people creating some wealth, creating some education, creating home ownership, many of them are under attack through the Supreme Court justice. And so we've got to take an additional look at what we're doing as advocacy organizations, as voices of Black businesses, as voices of Black people. So I'm honored to be here and excited about you taking the lead on this conversation. So looking forward.
Absolutely. First, just kind of explain for those who may not be familiar with the work that you do, the organization does, just explain how is it that you are even an expert to begin to approach this topic?
Well, expert is a stretch. I think this topic is one that's constantly evolving.
We're honest enough to approach it.
Yeah. I remember when I first came to Washington, D.C. in 2009, and I was doing a double-decker bus tour, just seeing the sights in Washington, D.C. And I noticed the backs of the license plates, and it literally reads, taxation without representation. And that just doesn't mean just for citizens of Washington, D.C. I take that to mean Black people across this country. We have been paying into a system that really has not represented our best interests, our concerns, and our issues. And so when the U.S. Black Chamber was originally created, our first pillar is around advocacy. We are here to fight for policies that are intentional, transparent, and held accountability. And so the U.S. Black Chamber has been given the tagline as the voice of Black-owned businesses. And we feel like historically, we've had great organizations fighting and advocating on behalf of civil rights. But I think in today's environment, it really has to come with an economic conversation. We really have to be pushing an economic agenda specifically for Black people. And so the U.S. Black Chamber was founded on what we call our 5 pillars. The first one is advocacy. The second one is access to capital. And when you ask any small business owner what their number one concern is, they will say access to capital. But when you talk to Black business owners, they will say their top 3 are access to capital as it relates to affordability, because we know we pay twice the rate on interest, as well as getting only 40% of the funds that we need. We also want it to be available. And so often, in so many cases, we don't have good banking partners in our communities. And then lastly, it's got to be accessible. We just saw during COVID where we lost 42% of all Black-owned businesses between the months of February 2020 and April. And when we surveyed those businesses, the majority of them said the reason that they closed was for 2 reasons. One being lack of information, but the other one was lack of capital. And when we say capital, the majority of those businesses were looking for less than $7,500 to keep their doors open. But our banking partners, the large ones across the country, weren't interested in providing the small business loans. They were more interested in creating opportunities for large businesses. If you remember, when COVID first happened, on a Friday afternoon, there was an announcement made. There was going to be this plan that was laid out, came out to $349 billion of stimulus. By Saturday afternoon, $250 billion had already been awarded to 50 white publicly traded firms. The question was never asked, did anybody die? Was anyone forced to stay home? Did you lose any business? Did you lose customers? Did you lose revenue? It was really about relationships. And so for many Black-owned businesses, we just don't have those relationships with financial institutions. And so the U.S. Black Chamber has worked to create a vehicle for Black-owned businesses to get the capital that they need to grow and expand their businesses. The third one is around contracting opportunities. And I often meet with corporate America, and they say, well, Ron, we do more business with Black business owners, but we can't find them, and or they don't have the size and scale. And so the U.S. Black Chamber created the only Black business certification platform in this country. Up until that certification, now called By Black, BYBLACK.US, you could be certified as a woman-owned business. You could be certified as an Asian-owned business, a disabled veteran. You could be certified as a gay and lesbian-owned business. But if you were a Black-owned business, the certification that you fell under was minority. And we're saying we got lost in the minority conversation because as we had prior to Biden being elected, we advocated for transparency. So often we hear about the minority spend, and we want to spend a little bit of time talking about the minority spend. But when you really look at what that represents, and for the first time in this country's history, he was able to disaggregate the numbers based upon our advocacy. And what he told us in front of what we call our Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in front of our business center there, he said that the Asian community, the business community, received 1.8% of all the federal government minority spend. The Hispanic community was receiving about 1.7%, and Black business owners that have roughly 13% of the businesses that are certified to do business with the federal government were only receiving 1.5%. So we said, we're not interested in minority conversations. We want to know what is being done for Black business owners. And so the USBC created the By Black certification so that we could be found, we could be intentionally supported, and we can make sure that our dollars are being counted. The next one was really around entrepreneurial training, and then the last one was around chamber development. When we began the U.S. Black Chamber in 2009, we had 6 chambers affiliated with us. Today, we have over 169 chambers. We just got that update on Wednesday. So we're very, very proud of the growth that we've had, but more importantly, about the success that we're having in reference to our voice being heard, our advocacy being acted.
Well, thank you for that. And you touched on so many things. Bidenomics, I definitely want to touch on. But first, when you talked about policy, I'll tell you, I got into a little IG Instagram beef with someone because they made a comment on a video about 2 Black men were arguing. And in her comment, she said, that's why we don't have anything. And I just had to interrupt her and say, let me tell you something. Before you get to the beef that they had, she talked about specifically, she said, that's why the wealth gap is so high. And I had to shut her down and say, before you start talking about the wealth gap being high and blaming it on Black people, you need to go back to redlining. You can go back to slavery. You can talk about what happened after Reconstruction. You can talk about Jim Crow laws. There are so many things that you missed over Blacks not being able to participate in the GI Bill. And so those were policies that were put in place. Just before the March on Washington, the 60th anniversary this year, there was a report that came out by the Economic Policy Institute. And in this report, it said that race-neutral policies will not adequately provide solutions to eliminate economic disparities. And I've heard many people ask this question in several different ways, but what do you think on that? Should there be things that are race specific? I understand race inclusive, but specific.
Just based upon the data that I just gave you, so often we let outside influencers tell our story. We talk about minority spend. And President Biden will tell you, hey, we're trying to get the minority spend from 11% to 15%. Great goal. But if you really look at the numbers, in that 11%, 78% of that minority spend is white women. So it's still staying in the white community, still staying in that family environment of white people. So even though there are programs specific for the minority community, it still ends up in the same hands that we're trying to say, can you share some of that wealth? So yes, there's got to be specific programs, specific intentionality. So again, intentionality, transparency, and accountability is what we're calling for all programs created. As we speak today, the one program that was created specifically for Black and brown businesses was a program called the SBA's 8A program. Mm-hmm. I'm a former 8A business, and so I know that it has created more wealth from a Black business perspective than any other program that the federal government had created. It's ironic that right before the fourth quarter, where the majority of those dollars are spent, that program is coming under attack by the same individuals that sued the Supreme Court and sued higher education for affirmative action programs. Now it's the same people attacking the SBA's 8A program under the auspices of disadvantaged versus race-based institutions. And so now you'll start to see white men that are left-handed saying, hey, I've been discriminated against because I'm a left-handed. You'll start to see more people trying to get that same 11%, so that even though that we're only getting 1.5%, that percentage is going to get even smaller. We've got to make sure that we don't let other people say it's going to just be about disadvantage, but it's got to be about race neutral, not race neutral. It's got to be race specific.
When we talk about Bidenomics and what has happened under this president, can you give specifics for, because I go back and forth with people all the time. I don't see anything. What's happening? And though you can look at the list of everything that has happened under this administration, but still there is a different sentiment when it comes to how many Americans feel. When you look at Bidenomics, can you talk about any of the policies that the president has put forth that have really helped build wealth in the Black community?
You mentioned two great examples. My father went to the military coming out of high school, went off to the military, fought in the war with the idea they were going to be able to come home, get a GI Bill to go to college, purchase a home, and then redlining came into play. And they redlined him out of all of those opportunities. And the same thing is happening today. We here in Washington, D.C. create great programs. By the time they get to those local states, local communities, those governors, many of the senators, local elected officials never allow the communities that need it the most, the ones that we live in and we support, we never hear about the opportunities. I always lived in Oakland, California, and I always used to see, well, gosh, why are the opportunities always landing in the same communities and our communities don't get it? It's based upon local politics. And so a lot of things can be created here in Washington, D.C., but it's about that local elected official that has to implement those programs. You have to make sure that you're fighting not just for a president, but also for a mayor, for a senator, for a governor that's going to make sure that your best interests are being heard and being implemented upon. The president is doing all he can. We've got a Congress that is not very open to supporting minority and particularly Black-owned communities and Black business.
I think that's a key thing for people to really realize how this money trickles down. And the majority of African Americans actually live in that Southern Belt region. And so those are many states that have Republican-led lawmakers, and so that are pushing back on money that is being afforded to those communities. And we're seeing what happened in many cases. Either they're not using it in the way or not accepting the money in certain ways. It is. So we always start at the federal level, but I think people really need to understand how politics work right in their own communities. Another question is, I was reading this great article and it was talking about the answers to closing the wealth gap is found by Blacks investing or even moving outside of the U.S.? Now, I know that you have been on panels that have talked about global investments, even looking into investing into the continent of Africa, things like that. What do you think about that when people say that's a big part? If we can't find what we want here in the U.S., what about looking globally?
I just got back from a trip, business trip in Africa. We spent several days in Johannesburg, South Africa, and then spent the remainder of time in Ghana. And I think the misconception is that, hey, I have a product or a business here in America, and I'm going to take it over to Africa and sell it to Africans. Understand that Africans really have a struggling economy in many of the countries. And so what we really need to be thinking about is how can we go to Africa, take the products that they're creating there, that they're building there, and bring those back to American citizens and sell their products here. I think Americans look at it always from an insular conversation. How can I improve my own conditions here as a Black American? We've got to look at Black people across the globe to say, how can we improve our conditions for us as a community, global community? And that's where we will start to see our wealth having expansion across the globe. We can't just look at this and say, hey, what about me? And what about my family? What about my neighborhood? As a Black people, we've got to look at what's happening across the globe. I will say that 98% of America's growth is going to come outside of our boundaries. And so to have partnerships on the continent of Africa is an extremely potential, a good opportunity, good potential, but you've got to be very smart about what it is you're investing in. And are you investing in the long-term return? Or are you trying to invest in an immediate return? And sometimes we get disappointed in America when it's not a quick return on our investment, as opposed to saying, how can we improve the conditions of Black people around the world?
Just before we go, just a couple of more questions. Another hot topic that many people talk about a lot is reparations. The RAND study estimated that it could take, as I said before, the $3 trillion to close the wealth gap. Where do you see reparations playing in that?
We just had our national conference, literally, well, it's been 2 months now, back in July. And we had a great panel on reparations. We have done this is the third time to discuss the conversation. It's ironic that you and I just talked about the stimulus package being $349 billion. And I remember as a young Black person talking about, man, we can't have that conversation because the number is just too big. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars, but yet before there was really any idea of what COVID really meant, we were able to come up with close to $350 billion to address a virus that was here attacking American citizens. This is the same type of virus that we're seeing here in America as it relates to Black people. So we need a stimulus package for Black people. We can't talk about eliminating the wealth gap. We can't even talking about improving conditions for Black people until we go back to the core. And that is that we were a commodity for white people. When you go to Africa, the one thing that you will notice is that how much of a system slavery was. And this was a system that was built upon the backs of Black people. The story goes over 211 million Black people that died before they ever reached America to create the wealth of America. And so we've got to address slavery. We've got to address reparations. But reparations has got to come in various ways, not just a check being written to us, but a real conversation about what parity, what equity really looks at. I do believe that a check is definitely involved, but I think we need to have creativity. I will also say that under the recent political environment, reparations is going to be a difficult conversation to have. If we can't even have a conversation about affirmative action, which historically has worked in this country, to now have a conversation about reparations, I think is one that may be a little bit out of touch and out of sync. I think it is a future conversation that needs to be had, and I think we need to continue to fight for it. I just think we need to be very, very smart. and make sure that we are widening the conversation to get people on both sides of the conversation to say this is good for the American economy as well as the Black people in general.
Thank you. Ron, before we go, just your comments to people who say we don't have an economic or wealth agenda. I know you've been working hard at this. Where is it? Where is the Black economic wealth agenda? Where is that plan?
Well, I would say it's been created. It's always an ebb and flow. But know that the U.S. Black Chamber always is here representing that Black agenda. You know, we're getting ready for a political conversation, a big campaign going on. And we know that we've heard the conversation about making America great. And we at the U.S. Black Chamber say Black folk want America to be great as well. But in order for there to be a great America, there must be a great Black America.
Yes.
And in order to have a great Black America, you must have great Black businesses. And in order to have great Black businesses, you must have great Black chambers. And so we are standing in the gaps, continually fighting on behalf of Black businesses, fighting on behalf of that Black economic conversation that you're saying many people aren't there. But understand that is not the case. We are definitely involved in an economic agenda for African Americans, for Black people around the country. And we will continue to do that as we go forward.
Where can people go to find out more information? I know you have a policy brunch that's coming out. Congressional Black Caucus Weekend is approaching. There are going to be so many events, but I know you, your organization has always been involved in a lot of the conversations and discussions that happen around that time and after then too.
Yeah, what I want to tell people is CBC is a week. The Black conversation is ongoing. And so you can always go to usblackchambers.org, www.usblackchambers.org, and find out what is happening on a consistent basis. We have a Black print, which lays out our policy priorities, and it also will give you a step-by-step agenda of what you can do in your local community, from a policy perspective, for your state, and for your local community, as well as the national agenda. We are having an event the Thursday of Congressional Black Caucus. You can find out more information about that as well. But we are consistently doing education webinars. We do on average about 18 a month. Those are free of charge so people can understand what's going on, not only here in Washington, D.C., but around the country, how to improve your conditions as a business owner, get the resources, get the information, as well as the acumen that you need to be a better business owner, a better citizen, and a better family person. And so we want to make sure that those businesses that are listening can find out more information about us, and we would love to find out more information about them. And lastly, make sure that they onboard their businesses. We want to be able to find you. We want to be able to support you. During COVID, 70% of Black people said, hey, if it was a Black-owned product and a white-owned product, everything being equal, they would love to support the Black-owned product. We've got to make sure that we're telling them how to find your Black-owned product. So make sure you're onboarding your business free of charge at BYBLACK.us, buyblack.us, and we'll make sure that you get the resources and the information that you need to be a successful business owner.
I love it. I love it. I just want to end this quote that I always keep around with me when I'm talking about business from Madam C.J. Walker, who said, quote, "I am not satisfied in making money for myself. I endeavor to provide employment for hundreds of women of my race." And that's just to remember that the true power of Black wealth lies not just in the accumulation of wealth, but also in community transformation. Ron, thank you so much. You are always welcome back on this platform.
Thank you for having us, and we look forward to the next conversation as well as continuing to support you and your platform as well. Thank you.
Thank you.